Africa has recommitted itself to industrialization as the major driver for economic growth, structural transformation, and sustainable development. But this is not the first time in the continent's history that it has done so. Previous attempts, however, didn't work. And we have to ask ourselves, what went wrong? Why is there so little industry in Africa? On this program, we'll be speaking to Dr. John Page, a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institute and country director of the International Growth Center here in Tanzania. Dr. John Page is also one of the lead researchers and authors of the collaborative project between the African Development Bank, the UNIDO Institute, and the Brookings Institute titled Learning to Compete, which also addresses some of these questions about Africa and its industrialization. Primarily, why are there so few industries in Africa? Dr. John Page, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So just to start out with, we hear about industrialization as this straightforward shift from an agrarian or primary economy into a manufacturing secondary economy, and it all seems so straightforward. But why are so many countries then not able to follow through on this?
Well, I think there are two things going on here. The first one is that we've had a tendency based both on history, certainly the economic transformation of Western Europe, the United States, and the recent experience of East Asia, to associate the idea of structural transformation with industrialization. The shift from agriculture into other activities that have higher output per worker or are more productive is what structural transformation is about. But, for example, one of the early pioneers of thinking about structural change, Sir Arthur Lewis, was very clear in his own mind that the system of production need not be industry itself. It had to be modern organization of production. But high value added agriculture, other kinds of services activities which have high value added per worker could also be part of this structural transformation process. So we do have a tendency, I think, again, based on the history and the experience of the countries that have successfully gone through this process of structural transformation, to associate that with industrialization. But as you point out, it's neither an automatic nor an easy process. And it depends on policy, it depends on circumstance, and it depends to some extent on luck.
In your opinion, are there any kind of special or unique circumstances that Africa faces, either that have hindered its industrialization up until now, or that perhaps better than ever before have placed it in a position to be able to industrialize?
I think the answer, in fact, is all of the above. First, there are undoubtedly, if one were to compare the post-independence period with today, huge achievements in building the basics, infrastructure, skills. One cannot downplay the important contributions that African countries have made to the education of their people over the last 50 years. At the same time, one thing that's changed fundamentally is that I believe there's a window of opportunity opening, which will be for the continent to seize, I think, if it chooses to do so. And the reason why I say that is we know that real wages in China are rising. One of the pieces of work that a group of us working with the African Development Bank, UNIDO, and the Brookings Institution did over the last several years was a project we called Learning to Compete. And when we came to the end of the project and tried to understand why there was so little industry in Africa, one of the questions we asked ourselves was it bad policy or bad luck? And what we found, in fact, was that it was both. That the early policies of trying to force industrialization through state investment and through closing the economy to import competition resulted in a brief bloom of industrial development, but one that was uncompetitive. One then, of course, went into the structural adjustment period. And that had both its positive in terms of macroeconomic management aspects and its negative aspects, including really pushing the deindustrialization of many countries around the continent. But coming out of that period in the early 1990s, Africa no longer faced Europe and North America as the dominant industrial power. They faced the Chinese. And China fundamentally changed the equation because it was an export-oriented economy with low real wages, with significant industrial agglomerations and significant capabilities. So it doesn't surprise me that African policymakers, even those who wanted to spur industrial development, found themselves in a world in which it was very difficult to compete. But we now know that real wages are rising quite rapidly in China. And Justin Lin, for example, who's a distinguished Chinese economist, former chief economist of the World Bank, cites a figure of 85 million jobs that he believes will need to be offshored from China to somewhere else. That's an enormous opportunity. The question is, where will those jobs go? Undoubtedly, some of them will go to Asia. It's the neighborhood. And so Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, the Philippines clearly are going to take up some of that space. But there's really no reason why Africa can't also take advantage of that window of opportunity. Not every country and not in the same way. But certainly the coastal economies, certainly economies that have relationships both with Asian markets and with European markets, do have a new opportunity that didn't exist in the 1990s. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. It's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic that there's some potential for industrialization. I think the other thing that makes me optimistic is that we're in a world in which, to some extent, how we think about economic activity is changing quite fundamentally. The information revolution, the telecommunications revolution, and the dramatic decline in transport costs have created a whole new set of what I think of as industries without smokestacks that are high value added per worker, that are tradable, so they fit with the export part of the troika of things that determine industrial location. And that Africa tends to have a number of comparative advantages in. If you think of tourism, for example, it's hard to think of, certainly sitting here in Tanzania, a place that is more blessed with a wide variety of tourism resources than one has. If you think about the fact that most Africans speak, or at least those who've gone through secondary school and university, speak at least one major European language, unlike in Asia. Information-based technologies, remote office services, other kinds of activities of that sort are very possible. If you think about the opportunities that countries like Kenya and Ethiopia have exploited, or Senegal, in horticultural products or cut flowers. These kinds of activities, if we were redoing the economic statistics today, we'd think of as being more like manufacturing than like traditional services. So this hotel clearly has very little in common with a two-room hotel that serves local travelers. Has extremely high value added per worker. It has demanding labor force requirements. It offers the opportunity for growth in many options. So I think from the point of view of expanding the range of possibilities for Africa, one, there's an opportunity in manufacturing, but two, for countries that are either landlocked or have large endowments of natural resources where manufacturing is perhaps less of a possibility. These new industries without smokestacks provide a range of other alternatives. And the good news here is that because these activities, these firms that engage in this sort of production, have many of the same characteristics as manufacturing firms, they respond to the same sets of drivers of location. So there's not a trade-off. You don't have to say, oh, well, in order to promote tourism, we have to do one thing, but in order to have a t-shirt factory, we should do something different. So that's what makes me optimistic, is the fact that I think this is really a major window of opportunity for the continent.
So another question about industrialization in terms of who can take a leading role. Is this something now that we're seeing two schools of thought emerging? One arguing that we should go regional and coordinate and industrialize as regions, as groups of countries. Or another one that says actually we should base this on cities and the regions around them rather than focusing on the country as a whole. Where do you stand, and what's your view on both of these opportunities?
There are successful industrial policy models of virtually all sorts. China, for example, at least in its last generation of industrial policy, largely decentralized industrial policy making and left it to cities and to provinces. But China's an enormous country. Africa is a collection of 53 considerably smaller countries. So I think in the first instance, the national government has to think strategically about what its objectives are and what it wants to achieve. Having said that, there is certainly a role for local authorities and local communities in this process. To give you an example, one of the highly successful innovations that has been used in Asia to try to solve this problem of attracting firms when you have a relatively sparse industrial landscape is to create a special economic zone and to provide a set of high-quality infrastructure, institutions, and to some extent incentives to bring firms together as a group into that kind of a zone. Where the zones tend to fail is if the local authorities that manage the economy just outside the zone aren't also part of that process. Because then even as successful a country as Ethiopia, where the zones have really taken off, to give you a specific example, just outside of Addis Ababa, there's a very large Chinese-funded special economic zone. It's experiencing great difficulty getting its workers to the zone because there's no public transport between the areas where people live in Addis and the zone itself. The zone functions beautifully. And the Ethiopian government, as national government, has done everything it can to help the Chinese developers of the zone. But the fact that the city government wasn't brought in at the same time and someone didn't think about the fact that you needed to have buses or whatever to get the workers to the jobs has meant that it's been more of a problem to get the zone off and running than one would have hoped. So I think there's a balance here that needs to take place between local authorities and national authorities, though in the case of the average size of Africa's countries, I think the national government will remain very much the centerpiece of thinking about industrial policy. I think the regional aspect of development is enormously important because one can learn from engaging in trade with one's neighbors. And at least in some cases, we have clear indications, and Tanzania would be one of the cases, of industry having great success in beginning to penetrate the export markets of near neighbors, both in the Great Lakes region and in the East African community, as a stepping stone into becoming globally competitive. One thing we do think we know now is back to this idea of firm capabilities or the knowledge of running the firm, that firms learn from exporting. And it's a tough competitive world out there if you want to dive right into the deep pool of the global market. But it may be slightly less difficult to become a viable exporter into the regional market. And then from that process, develop your capabilities to the point where you can go global.
Is the way that we think of industrialization correct? I mean, you've mentioned now this idea of switching between industry or industrialization and structural transformation. But what about this idea that we necessarily have to industrialize in order to transform?
No, but for most countries, it may be the most likely path. The reason why I say no is we know of economies that have structurally transformed, for example, on the basis of agriculture. New Zealand would be a case in point. High productivity modern agriculture, with the result that it is one of the most prosperous economies in the world. But in general, in particular where you have processes of urbanization going on, where you have people leaving the rural areas, and where you're struggling to try to find jobs for people in urban settings, quite clearly there's a need to think intelligently about what sorts of job-generating activities are you going to try to promote. And hence the reason why, for the most part, what we've seen is a transition that moves from mainly agrarian activities organized on traditional means to mainly industry and services-based activities organized on what one might call more modern organization of production. But it's not unique, and the factor that may, to some extent, also complicate the story in Africa is as more countries become richer in natural resources, then there's the question of, well, then how do we manage the natural resource wealth as a part of this process of the structural transformation of the economy? We know that mines and gas fields don't create very many jobs. So it does bring us back to a question again of what is the role of government and the public sector in thinking through how you use natural resource revenues to get a more diversified economy, to create the kinds of employment potential that one needs. Certainly one group of resource-rich economies, which is the countries of the Arab Gulf, has basically decided that the model will be that the state is the employer of last resort. But not every economy may have that degree of resource wealth, and not every economy may want to have that approach to creating jobs. So thinking through what natural resources mean, both from the point of view of economic diversification and from the point of view of how the government then begins to build the basis for a more diversified economy, is going to be a really major challenge, I think.
Is the way that we think of industrialization correct? I mean, you've mentioned now this idea of switching between industry or industrialization and structural transformation. But what about this idea that we necessarily have to industrialize in order to transform?
Well, just in a way, coming back to a plug for this idea that there are things we don't call industry that do provide a basis for structural transformation, I think is the answer to that. That you know, what I think may be a mistake on the part of some policymakers is to have too close an association in their mind between the idea that you have to have smokestacks to create jobs that are high enough productivity to provide good employment, when in fact there are a range of other things that can also be part of that same package. And I think perhaps the industry, if you will, that has enjoyed the least understanding and success with policymakers is the tourism industry itself. I think, including with some of the aid agencies, there's a tendency to dismiss tourism as being something that somehow that's not really developmental. But I look around and I say, why? Why not? If you think about it, it touches virtually every part of the economy. Transport, food services. The question, and the crucial one, comes back to the same thing that we face even if we were building a t-shirt factory. How engaged are local businesses in supplying the inputs into the industry? Where are the value chains beginning to evolve? How do we encourage an expansion of activity? How do we safeguard the natural assets of the country on which much of the tourism is based? It seems to me that by being a little broader in terms of our thinking of what does structural transformation mean and what kinds of things contribute to that, you can get a lot more leverage out of the idea, and also you can be more creative in terms of addressing the jobs challenge.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for coming on the program, and welcome again soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.